"You're too slow. Pack your tools and get off my site." The words landed in the open air of the construction yard like a hammer dropped on concrete. Flat, final, meant to be heard by every man standing within 30 feet of it. And they were heard, every one of them. 16 workers stood scattered across the half-finished framework of the Caldwell Municipal Library expansion, a $4.2 million project, 18 months in the making, 2 weeks from its promised completion date. They had been moving, hauling, measuring, cutting. Then the foreman's voice cracked across the yard, and one by one they stopped. Tools lowered, eyes cast sideways, the kind of stillness that settles over a crowd when something is happening that everyone recognizes and no one is willing to name. The man those words were aimed at was named Elias Boone. He was 43 years old, and he stood at the base of a scaffolding tower with a spirit level in one hand and a chalk line in the other. And he did not flinch. He did not raise his head immediately. He finished the mark he had been making on the concrete block, set the chalk line down with deliberate care, and only then looked up at Dale Pruitt, the site foreman, who stood 12 feet away with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and a look on his face that said he had already decided everything there was to decide. "You heard me," Dale said. "You're too slow. I don't run a charity. Get your gear and go." The crowd watched. Not one of them moved toward Elias. Not one of them spoke. Elias said nothing. He bent down, picked up his chalk line, and coiled it with the same patience he had given every task that morning. Now, freeze that moment right there. Because what Dale Pruitt did not know, what not a single man on that site fully understood, was who Elias Boone actually was, what he had built, what he was capable of, and what was about to happen before the sun came up the following morning. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Elias grew up in East Baton Rouge, where the houses sat close together and the yards were small, and the men who lived there worked with their hands because that was what was available, and because pride in craft was one of the few things that could not be taken from you by a bad economy or a dismissive foreman or a world that had decided before you opened your mouth what you were worth. His grandfather, a man named Cornelius Boone, had been a finished carpenter for 31 years. He never owned a truck with his name on the side. He never had a storefront or a business card. What he had was a reputation that traveled quietly from job to job, the way real reputations travel, not through advertising, but through the evidence left behind in the work itself. A staircase banister in a house on Prescott Avenue, a set of built-in shelves in a church reading room on Delmar Street, joints so clean and tight they looked machined rather than made by hand. Cornelius had one saying he returned to whenever Elias was impatient or frustrated or tempted to announce himself before the work was ready to speak. "Stay low," he would say. "Build high. The ground doesn't argue with the building that stands on it." Elias had been 12 years old the first time he heard it. He had been 43 years old the morning Dale Pruitt told him he was too slow, and the saying had never left him. He had spent 30 years in the trades, not moving from job to job chasing wages, but going deep, learning every system a building could contain, every material it could be made of, every tolerance that separated a structure that would last from one that would fail quietly over time. He had started as a laborer, moved to concrete formwork, then structural steel, then finish work, then project coordination. He held a master tradesman certification in 3 disciplines. He had completed projects in 7 states. He had once, on a hospital renovation in Memphis, personally supervised the resequencing of an entire mechanical installation after the original contractor defaulted, and brought the project in 11 days ahead of schedule without a single change order. He did not talk about any of this. He had never needed to. He had come to the Caldwell project as a day laborer, deliberately, because he was between contracts and a friend had asked him to fill a gap on the crew for a few weeks. He had not introduced himself to Dale Pruitt as anything other than a pair of hands available for daily work. He wore the same canvas work pants and worn steel-toed boots as every other man on the site. He carried his own tools in a bag older than some of the younger workers, and he had done what he always did: arrived early, worked steadily, and said very little. What he had also done, in 3 weeks on the site, was study the project from the inside out. He had read the drawings, not glanced at them, but read them, the way a surgeon reads a chart. He had walked every section of the structure during lunch breaks, noting what was complete, what was pending, and what had been done incorrectly and would need correction before the building could pass inspection. He had made notes in a small green notebook he kept in the breast pocket of his jacket. He had said nothing about any of it to anyone. The ground, his grandfather had taught him, does not argue. But the building was 2 weeks from its deadline, and there were problems that Dale Pruitt either had not seen or had chosen not to address, and Elias had known for several days that the project was in trouble. He just hadn't said so yet. Now, here is what most people on that site did not know about Dale Pruitt. Dale had been a foreman for 11 years, and in those 11 years he had built a particular kind of authority, the kind that depends not on competence but on volume. He was loud. He was certain. He moved through a job site with the absolute confidence of a man who had never been seriously questioned, and the effect of that confidence on the men around him was real, even when the confidence itself was not. He had grown up in Alachua County, the son of a building contractor, and had inherited the business at 32 when his father retired. He had leveraged that inheritance into a subcontracting operation that now employed 47 people across 3 active projects. He drove a black F350 with his company name stenciled on the door. He wore a hard hat that was cleaner than any hard hat had a right to be on an active construction site. He shook hands with the general contractor's project manager every Monday morning with the easy familiarity of a man who knew which relationships kept the work coming. He also had a habit, one that several of his longer-tenured workers had noticed and learned not to challenge, of deciding very quickly what a man was capable of. The decision, once made, was rarely revised. It was based on things Dale would not have named aloud, the way a man carried himself, whether he seemed like someone who belonged in authority or someone who did not. Elias Boone had not seemed to Dale like someone who belonged. He was quiet. He worked at a pace that was steady rather than hurried. He did not seek Dale's approval or laugh at Dale's jokes or defer to his pronouncements about the right way to do things. He simply worked, and the work he produced was careful and exact, and somehow that carefulness had registered to Dale not as precision, but as slowness. On a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October, with the project behind schedule and the general contractor's project manager due on site that Friday, Dale Pruitt had looked across the yard at Elias Boone making a chalk mark on a concrete block and decided, in the way he decided things, that the problem was the man with the chalk line. He had walked over. He had said what he said, and now the yard was still, and 16 men were watching, and Elias Boone was coiling his chalk line with the patience of a man who had lived inside this moment before and had decided, long ago, exactly how he would inhabit it. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He looked at Dale Pruitt with an expression that was not anger, and was not submission, and was not anything Dale had a ready category for, and he said quietly, "All right." 2 words. That was all. He picked up his bag. He walked toward the site entrance. He passed within arm's length of 6 of his co-workers, and not one of them met his eyes. One did. A man named Marcus Webb, 28 years old, a second-year apprentice who had been on the site since the project's start. Marcus was standing near the material staging area with a bundle of rebar wire in his hands, and when Elias passed him, Marcus gave the smallest nod, barely a movement at all, more an acknowledgement than a gesture. His jaw was tight. His eyes said what his mouth could not afford to say in front of Dale Pruitt. Elias saw it. He returned the nod. And he kept walking. What no one on that site knew yet was that Elias had not gone home. He had sat in his truck at the far end of the parking lot for 23 minutes. He had opened his green notebook and looked at the notes he had been keeping for 3 weeks. The sequences, the deficiencies, the measurements, the list of tasks that remained between the current state of the project and a structure that could pass inspection on the date the contract required. He had done the arithmetic. Not the rough arithmetic of a man making an estimate, but the precise arithmetic of a man who had done this before and knew exactly what the numbers meant. The project was 14 working hours from completion. 14 hours of correctly sequenced, correctly executed work by someone who knew what they were doing. He looked at the clock on his dashboard. It read 9:47 in the morning. He made a decision. He was not angry. He was not looking for acknowledgement or apology or the satisfaction of watching Dale Pruitt's expression change. He was doing what he was about to do because the building was not finished, and a building that was not finished correctly was a building that would eventually fail someone, and that was not something Elias Boone was willing to leave behind him. His grandfather had not built staircases that held for 60 years because he wanted credit. He had built them that way because that was the only way he knew how to build. Elias closed the notebook. He put the truck in gear. He drove to the nearest supply yard where he had an account, and he began to make a list. Now, here's what the Caldwell Municipal Library project actually needed in order to be completed on time. The building had 4 outstanding systems. The first was the interior concrete block partition on the east wing's 2nd floor. 14 linear feet of block that had been set but not grouted, leaving a structural gap the drawings required to be filled before the mechanical rough-in above it could be inspected. The second was the suspended ceiling grid in the main reading room, framed but not decked. 42 ceiling tiles sitting in boxes because the crew had run short on main T-sections and no one had reordered them. The third was the exterior threshold work at the building's 3 public entrances, which required a specific mortar mix and tool profile that only one person on the site had been consistently getting right. That person was Elias. The fourth was the punch list, a 17-item document covering everything from a misaligned door frame to an exposed conduit run that violated the finish specification. Dale Pruitt knew about all 4 items. He had a plan built on the assumption that his crew would be sufficient and that Friday's review would buy him the time he needed. What Dale did not know was that Elias had read the inspector's punch list, a copy left unattended on the site superintendent's folding table 3 days earlier, and had quietly sourced the materials needed to address every item on it. He had not planned to use that knowledge. He had planned to finish his few weeks, collect his wages, and move on. But Dale Pruitt had changed the calculation. Not with the insult, not with the public dismissal, with the building. Because Elias had looked at that punch list and at the outstanding systems and at the Friday deadline and understood something Dale Pruitt had not yet grasped. The project was not going to make its deadline. Not with the crew Dale had. Not with the sequencing Dale was using. Not with the materials currently on site. The Caldwell Municipal Library was going to fail its Friday inspection. The general contractor was going to assess delay penalties, $1,200 per calendar day, specified in the subcontract, and Dale Pruitt, who had sent home the one man on his crew who understood exactly how to prevent that outcome, did not know any of it yet. Elias arrived at the supply yard on Meridian Road at 10:22. The air there smelled of cut lumber and wet concrete and the mineral sharpness of bagged mortar mix, a smell he had known since he was old enough to follow Cornelius through a job site door. He pulled to the loading area and sat with the engine idling and his green notebook open on the steering wheel. Every measurement, every quantity, every product specification had come from the drawings he had read and the notes he had taken over 3 weeks of careful, silent observation. He went inside and found the counter manager, a man named Roy Thibodeau, who had been working the yard for 19 years and who knew Elias from 2 previous jobs in the parish. Roy looked at the list, looked at Elias, and did not ask a single unnecessary question. He simply turned to his computer and began pulling inventory. That was the thing about a reputation built quietly over time. It did not need to introduce itself. It was already there, waiting, in the rooms where the work was known. The main T-sections were in stock. The mortar mix was there. The grout for the block partition was there. The specific margin trowel ground to a particular bevel, a tool Elias had brought in himself 3 years earlier on a different job, and which Roy had kept in stock ever since, was hanging on the pegboard behind the counter, and Roy took it down and set it on the pile without being asked. Elias loaded the truck himself, stacking the T-sections with the care of a man who understood that materials handled carelessly at the supply yard become problems at the job site, and problems at the job site become hours. He secured the load, checked the tension on both ratchet straps, and climbed back into the cab. He drove back toward the site, not to the front gate, because Dale Pruitt had sent him off the property, and Elias was not a man who walked through a door he had been told to leave. He drove instead to the adjacent vacant lot that shared a chain-link fence line with the library's east wing. Through the chain link he could see the second-floor block partition, the gap in the ceiling grid through the clerestory windows, and the angle where the threshold mortar had been applied incorrectly and would need to be cut back before the correct profile could be laid. He could see all of it, because he had been looking at it for 3 weeks. Now, here's what most people did not know about what happened next. Marcus Webb had not gone back to work after Elias left the site. He had stood at the material staging area for 6 minutes with the rebar wire still in his hands, and then he had set the wire down and walked to the far corner of the fence line and taken out his phone. He had Elias's number because Elias had given it to him 3 weeks earlier, on the second day of the job, when Marcus had made an error on a concrete measurement and Elias had corrected it quietly, without embarrassment, without reporting it to Dale. Marcus had asked why he hadn't said anything to the foreman. Elias had looked at him and said, simply, "Because the wall is right now. That's what matters." Marcus had saved the number that same afternoon. He called it now. Elias picked up on the second ring. "I'm in the lot," Elias said before Marcus could speak. "East side, at the fence." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not gone." "No." Another silence. Then Marcus said, "Dale doesn't know what he's looking at with that punch list. He thinks he's got 2 weeks. He doesn't. I know, Elias said. What are you going to do? Elias looked at the building through the chain link. He looked at his green notebook on the passenger seat, at the list of 14 hours of work that stood between the current state of that structure and a building that could pass inspection. I'm going to finish it, Elias said. 4 words. That was all. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I can get you access. There's a gate on the east fence. The lock code is the same as the equipment shed. I'll leave it open tonight. He paused. Dale doesn't come in before 7. Inspector's not until 2 in the afternoon. You don't have to do that, Elias said. I know I don't, Marcus said, and then he hung up. Elias sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the building. He thought about Marcus Webb, 28 years old, second-year apprentice, a man with a job he needed, and a foreman who could end it with a phone call. He thought about what it cost a young man to make that call. He thought about Cornelius, who had once told him that the people who help you quietly, at cost to themselves, are the ones you remember when the work is done, not the ones who applaud afterward, the ones who unlock the gate. He drove to a diner on Cypress Street and ordered coffee and eggs and ate slowly, because a man doing 14 hours of physical work alone through the night needed to eat, and eating was not sentiment, but preparation. He read through his notes, revised the sequence twice to account for cure time on the grout and the mortar, and wrote the revised sequence in the back of the notebook in a clean column, numbered 1 through 11. He left the diner at 1:15. He drove back to the vacant lot, reclined the truck seat, and closed his eyes. He slept for 4 hours, the way a man sleeps who has learned that rest is not indulgence, but discipline. He woke at 5:19. The sky to the west was the color of old brick, and the air through the cracked window had the cool edge of an October evening settling in. He drank the last of the coffee from his thermos, checked his tools, checked the load in the truck bed, checked his notebook. He was ready. At 6:47, when the last of the daylight had thinned to a pale line above the roof line, Elias Boone walked through the east gate of the Caldwell Municipal Library construction site. The gate was open. The lock hung from the chain, unlatched. Marcus Webb had done what he said he would do. Elias used a headlamp, a 2400 lumen unit he had carried on night work for 11 years. And he began with the block partition on the east wing's second floor, because the grout needed the most cure time and had to go first. He mixed the grout by hand in a bucket, the way Cornelius had taught him, reading the consistency by feel rather than by measure, because the measure got you close and the feel got you there. He filled the cores and the joints in the 14 linear feet of block with the patience of a man who understood that speed and grouting was the enemy of bond, and that bond was the difference between a wall that passed inspection and one that did not. He finished the partition at 8:51. He moved to the ceiling grid. The suspended ceiling in the main reading room was 38 feet wide and 62 feet long, and the grid had been framed but not completed because the crew had run short on main T-sections and no one had placed the reorder. Elias had placed the reorder that morning. He brought the sections in 6 at a time and laid them out in the sequence his notebook prescribed, working from the center of the room outward, snapping each T into its hanger wire with a sound like a small, clean percussion, the only sound in the empty building at 9 o'clock at night. He worked without music. He worked without conversation. He worked the way he had always worked. In the silence his grandfather had taught him was not emptiness, but concentration, the silence in which the work itself could be heard. The ceiling grid was complete at 11:43. He descended the scaffold, drank water, ate half a sandwich, and looked at his notebook. 2 items remained. the threshold work at the 3 public entrances, and the punch list. He began at the main entrance. The mortar applied to the threshold at the front door was the wrong profile, too shallow at the leading edge, which would allow water infiltration at the base of the door frame and would fail the inspector's moisture specification. Elias cut it back with a cold chisel and a mallet, working carefully so as not to disturb the adjacent block. He mixed the correct mortar, a polymer modified mix specified in the drawings sourced that morning from Roy Thibodeau's yard, and applied it with the beveled margin trowel, drawing the profile in a single continuous pass that left a surface as clean and exact as a machine could have made it. He moved to the second entrance, then the third. The clock on his phone read 2:17 in the morning when he finished the last threshold. He sat on the concrete step of the south entrance and looked at the empty parking lot under the sight lights, and he breathed. His shoulders ached. His knees, which had been giving him trouble since a fall on a Memphis job 4 years back, spoke to him in the low, persistent way they spoke after long hours on hard floors. He acknowledged the ache the way he acknowledged most discomfort, not by fighting it, not by ignoring it, but by noting it and continuing. He opened his notebook to the punch list. 17 items. The misaligned doorframe on the reading room's interior was a shim and screw correction that would take 12 minutes. The exposed conduit run in the east wing stairwell required a single conduit clamp and a cover plate, both of which he had in his bag. The remaining 15 items were of similar scale, the kind of corrections that accumulate on a job site, not because anyone intends to leave them, but because the attention of a foreman who operates by volume rather than precision tends to slide past the small things until the small things become the only things standing between a project and its completion. Elias addressed them in order. He did not skip the difficult ones. He did not estimate or approximate. He corrected each item to the specification written in the drawings, no more and no less, and he moved to the next. The last item was a gap in the weather stripping on the east wing's exterior door. A strip of neoprene, 3 feet long, cut short and left with a 1/4-inch gap at the bottom corner. Elias replaced it with a length from the roll he carried in his bag, pressing it into the channel with his thumb, working from one end to the other, feeling for the seal the way a man feels for truth, slowly, with attention, without assuming he already knew where it was. He stood. He opened the door and closed it twice, listening to the sound of the seal engaging. It was right. He looked at his phone. The time was 4:51 in the morning. He walked back through the building one final time, slowly, with his headlamp on and his notebook open, checking every section he had touched that night against the drawings and against the inspector's punch list and against the standard that Cornelius Boone had set for him 30 years ago. Everything was correct. He sat down on the concrete floor of the main reading room in the center of the space, under the ceiling grid he had completed 5 hours earlier, and he looked up at it in the beam of his headlamp. The T-sections ran in their precise parallel lines from one end of the room to the other. The hanger wires were plumb, the joints were clean. It was the kind of work that an inspector would walk past without comment, because work done correctly does not announce itself. It simply holds. He thought of Cornelius. He thought of a staircase banister on Prescott Avenue that was still holding 60 years after the hands that made it had gone still. He thought about what it meant to leave something behind that would outlast the argument about whether you were fast enough or slow enough, or whether you belonged on the site where you had built it. He closed the notebook. He put it in the breast pocket of his jacket, where it always lived. He did not leave a note. He did not leave a bill. He did not leave any evidence of his presence beyond the work itself. The grout in the block partition, the ceiling grid overhead, the threshold profiles at the 3 entrances, the 17 items on the punch list corrected to specification. He walked out through the east gate at 5:17 in the morning. He latched it behind him. He walked to his truck, put his tools in the bag, and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. The sky to the east had begun to change. Not light yet, not quite, but the darkness there was thinner than the darkness to the west. The way a wall shows its weakness before it fails, the way a day shows its intention before it arrives. He had done what he came to do. Not with anger, not with revenge, not with the need for anyone to know his name. He had done it because the building was not finished, and a building that was not finished correctly was a building that would eventually fail someone, and that was not something Elias Boone was willing to leave behind him. The ground does not argue with the building that stands on it. He put the truck in gear and drove east into the thinning dark. The Friday inspection arrived the way all reckonings arrive. Not announced, not dramatic, but simply present, standing at the door with a clipboard and a standard that did not care about excuses. The general contractor's inspector was a man named Gerald Foss, 51 years old, 23 years in the business, a man who had seen every variety of unfinished work that a deadline could produce, and who had learned to read a job site the way Elias read drawings, not for what it showed him, but for what it was trying to hide. He arrived at the Caldwell Municipal Library at 2 in the afternoon on Friday and walked through the front entrance with his clipboard and the particular expression of a man who expected to find problems. He did not find problems. He found the block partition on the east wing second floor grouted to specification, the cores filled, the joints struck clean, the mortar at the correct cure stage for a pour completed roughly 40 hours prior. He found the suspended ceiling grid in the main reading room complete, every main T in place, every hanger wire plumb, every joint aligned to the tolerance the drawings required. He found the threshold profiles at all 3 public entrances executed in the correct mortar mix with the correct tool profile. He found, working through the 17-item punch list he had generated on his previous visit, that every single item had been addressed. Every one. He stood in the main reading room for a long moment and looked up at the ceiling grid. Then he looked at Dale Pruitt, who was standing beside him with his clean hard hat and his crossed arms, and the expression of a man who had been expecting a different kind of conversation. "When did this get done?" Gerald Foss asked. Dale's arms uncrossed slowly. "What do you mean?" "The grid, the partition, the thresholds." Gerald looked at his clipboard, then back at Dale. "This wasn't here Tuesday. I walked this building Tuesday. None of this was here Tuesday." Dale said nothing for a moment. His jaw moved once, as if testing a word before deciding not to release it. "My crew got after it," he said, finally. Gerald Foss looked at him for a long, level moment. Then he looked back at the ceiling grid. Then he wrote something on his clipboard. The inspection passed. Now, here is what happened in the 48 hours that followed. Gerald Foss was a thorough man. He was also, in the way of thorough men, a curious one. The work he had seen in that building, the quality of it, the sequencing of it, the evidence of a single disciplined hand moving through a problem from first principle to last, did not match what he knew of Dale Pruitt's crew. He had inspected 3 of Dale's previous projects. He knew the standard Dale's operation produced, and what he had seen in the Caldwell Municipal Library was above it, significantly above it. He made a phone call, then another. He was not looking for trouble. He was looking for the answer to a question the work itself had posed, because Gerald Foss had been in the business long enough to know that work of that quality does not appear without a hand behind it, and a hand that good does not go unnoticed unless it has chosen to go unnoticed. The answer came through Marcus Webb. Marcus had said nothing to anyone about the East Gate or the phone call or the 4 words Elias had spoken from a parking lot on a Tuesday morning. He had gone back to work and finished his shift and carried what he knew, the way young men carry things they know to be right and cannot yet say aloud, quietly, at cost, with the jaw set and the eyes forward. But when Gerald Foss's inquiry reached the general contractor's project manager, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had been overseeing the Caldwell project from the owner's side for 14 months, Marcus Webb received a call from her office. Sandra Okafor was a precise woman and a fair one, and she asked Marcus a single direct question, and Marcus, who had been waiting for someone to ask it, answered it. He told her everything: the chalk line, the dismissal, the parking lot, the phone call, the East Gate, the 4 words. Sandra Okafor listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need his name." Marcus gave it to her. What happened next was not fast, because justice that is real is rarely fast. But it was thorough because Sandra Okafor was thorough, and because the record that Elias Boone had built over 30 years was not hidden. It was simply unannounced, sitting in the files of 7 state licensing boards and the project records of 14 completed contracts and the memory of every general contractor and inspector who had ever watched him work. It had always been there. It had simply been waiting for someone to look. Sandra Okafor looked. She found the Master Tradesman certifications. She found the Memphis Hospital renovation. She found the project in Shreveport where a structural error by a previous contractor had been identified and corrected by a day laborer who had read the drawings more carefully than the engineer of record. She found the letters. Not many of them, because Elias did not solicit letters, but the ones that existed were specific and unambiguous in the way that letters written by people who have seen something extraordinary tend to be. She brought what she found to the general contractor, to the owner's representative, and to the Caldwell Municipal Library's Board of Directors, who had a particular interest in knowing that the work which had passed inspection on Friday afternoon had been completed not by the subcontractor they were paying, but by a man that subcontractor had dismissed from the site as too slow on Tuesday morning. The board convened a meeting. It was not a long meeting. Dale Pruitt's subcontract was terminated. The grounds were misrepresentation, specifically the submission of a completed project to the general contractor without disclosure that the completion had been performed by a worker Dale had dismissed from the site, a worker whose labor Dale had neither compensated nor credited. The delay penalties that had been looming, $1,200 per calendar day, were assessed against Dale's bond because the project had made its deadline, and the reason it had made its deadline was documented and on record. Dale's bonding company was notified. His license came under review by the State Contractors Board, where 2 previous complaints from former employees, complaints that had been filed and set aside for lack of corroborating evidence, were reopened in light of the new record. The black F-350 with the company name stenciled on the door sat in the parking lot of Dale Pruitt's office for 3 weeks before the office closed. The 47 people who had worked for him found other crews, other foremen, other sites. It had not happened with anger. It had not happened with revenge. It had happened because a man had done his work correctly, and because a young apprentice had answered a direct question honestly, and because a project manager had been thorough enough to look at what the work itself was telling about her. Marcus Webb was offered a position on Sandra Okafor's next project, A full apprenticeship, with a contractor whose standard matched the one Marcus had been trying to hold himself to since the day Elias had corrected his concrete measurement without embarrassment and without report. He accepted it. He did not forget who had made it possible. He was not the kind of man who forgot things like that. Elias received a call from Sandra Okafor's office on the Monday following the inspection. He was sitting on the porch of his house on the east side of Baton Rouge, a small house, a narrow porch, a yard where his grandmother's Rose of Sharon still bloomed in the corner of the fence line every year without fail. The way things planted with patience and left alone tend to bloom. He answered the call and listened, and when Sandra Okafor finished explaining what had been found and what had been decided, he said, "I appreciate that." 5 words. That was all. She offered him a contract on the next project, a real one, with his name on it, at a rate that reflected what his certifications and his record actually commanded in the market. He accepted it. He stated the number that was correct, and she agreed to it, and that was the end of the negotiation. He sat on the porch for a while after the call ended. The morning was cool, and the Rose of Sharon had gone to seed for the season, its branches bare and patient in the October air, waiting for the spring that would come because it always came. He thought about Cornelius. He thought about a staircase banister on Prescott Avenue. He thought about the ceiling grid in the main reading room of the Caldwell Municipal Library, its T-sections running in their precise parallel lines, its hanger wires plumb, its joints clean. Work that would hold for decades without anyone knowing whose hands had placed it there. He was not troubled by that. He had never needed the building to know his name. He had only needed it to stand. The ground does not argue with the building that stands on it. Now, I want to say something directly before we leave this story behind. What happened to Elias Boone on that Tuesday morning in October is not a rare story. It happens in construction yards and hospital corridors and boardrooms and classrooms and every other space where human beings make judgments about other human beings based on things that have nothing to do with what those human beings are capable of. It happens to people who are extraordinary and to people who are ordinary, and the outcome is almost never as clean as this one. Almost never does the building speak for itself loudly enough for the right people to hear it. Elias Boone was not vindicated because the world is just. He was vindicated because he had spent 30 years building something that could not be argued with, and because a 28-year-old apprentice had been willing to answer a question honestly at cost to himself, and because one project manager had been thorough enough to look at what the work was telling her. 3 things, 3 people, in a world full of Dale Pruitts who decide in the first 3 days what a man is worth and never revise the decision. The question is not whether Elias deserved better. He did. The question is how many people like Elias are out there right now, working steadily, building carefully, saying very little, in rooms where no one has thought to look at what the work is telling them. That question does not have a comfortable answer, but it is the right question to sit with. Think about someone you know, or maybe yourself, who carries a skill, a knowledge, a depth of craft that the room they're standing in has never bothered to see. Drop a comment and tell me about it. I want to hear it. Every week on this channel we find the people the world overlooked and we tell their stories, because those stories deserve to be told, and because the people who carry them deserve to be seen. If that's the kind of storytelling that matters to you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it today.